Hi, can you hear me? That's
Can.
scary. My big face on the screen there. I apologise for that, all of you. I just want to say thanks for letting me come in remotely. I'm doing this keynote sandwich in between other meetings, so I'm usually quite busy for Friday meetings. So I'm sorry I can't be there. And I think just following on from I was watching the questions of the last speaker. I think it's interesting. We've got fully online conferences. We know how to do those. I think we know how to do face-to-face conferences. But I still think we're kind of finding our way around these blended ones a bit, and how sort of best to make use of them and how for it to be equitable, I think. So I hope this works today, but apologies that I couldn't be there today. So I'm going to try share my presentation. That's always, you've disabled screen sharing, it says, so can you enable screen sharing?
Security.
Share screen in the middle.
Okay, cool, thank you. Cool. Are you seeing that okay?
We are, thank you.
Great, okay, thanks. Yeah, so it was interesting to hear the previous speaker. There's kind of lots of policy work around educating for the common good. I think I'm probably going to take a slightly different approach to it, and I think the two are completely compatible. So we'll talk about different aspects of open education and openness in education, for which I'm kind of giving the general title of Open Education Practice. I was going to do an about me things because sometimes when you're presenting online, people don't know who you are, but it was such an excellent introduction. Actually, that introduction's covered nearly all of my talks. We could all just break and have coffee. That's me anyway, and I'll go into those details anyway, and that's me on Twitter and blogging. So open education, open educational practice, it's one of those terms that can mean pretty much anything you want it to mean. So in terms of definitions, I'm not sure if it means we've got a deficit of definition or one good definition or surplus. We've got too many definitions, these kind of things. So open educational practice, what does it mean? So I don't know how many people are online or whether you want to just kind of shout this out, but I was going to have some kind of conversation about what does open educational practice mean to you? What would that, if someone said that phrase to you, what would immediately come to mind in terms of your own practice, your own institution, what you go about? So have a quick think about that. We probably won't have time to follow up on it. But I think it's, it means lots of different things to different people, and a lot of that will come from your own experience. So I've put together some quotes here. So for some people, I think it's kind of really embedded in the use of open educational resources. So it's how you use those resources. So you can see that definition up on the top left there from Knoll and Ellers. And down the bottom it's about OER production, management, use and reuse, open public pedagogies, open learning, open scholarship, open sharing of teaching ideas, and use of open technologies from Helen Beaton. And actually, I think Helen's collection of things there will probably cover a lot of what I'm going to do. And Catherine Cronin is a very good writer on open educational practice. These conceptualizations vary widely, and she has an excellent paper on kind of very different definitions. But I think, in many ways, I think it started out as an extension of open educational resources and how to use those and develop them and put them into practice. But it's come to mean, I think, and embrace a lot of different things about what we mean by implementing openness in education. So I'm going to slightly cheat here and just give my version of almost an accidental life in openness that's kind of happened through my career, which happens to take in a lot of those different kind of definitions. I've been at the Open University for 27 years now, so completely institutionalised, couldn't go and work anywhere else now. But during that time, I've taken on kind of a lot of different things around openness. And I think before the 1990s, when we talked about open education, people generally thought of open universities, like Open University or other models, Athabasca in Canada, for instance. And that's kind of what people meant by open education. And the OU's mission, it's a really good mission, actually. I think most mission statements are kind of, a bit word salad of kind of noble sounding things. But the OU's one's actually quite quite clearly defined and has a lot of connotations to it. So we're open to people, methods and ideas. And I think that's really important because each of those has has a realisation for how we constructed the teaching at local universities. So if you wanted to be open to people, for instance, that meant removing entry barriers. So you can come and study at the Open University without having done A-levels. Methods, so we employed a number of different methods, particularly distance education. Places, so you don't have to come to a central location, and ideas, particularly in terms of using different technologies and those sort of things. So it really kind of, that mission statement really shaped how the OU set about its whole approach. And so that's one kind of aspect of open education, if you like, this method of removing barriers and access to education. But then I think with the advent of the internet, people began to talk about different versions of openness. And I think a lot of networks and digital applications, people think of them as being open, so that the internet itself is an open network. Nowadays, anyone can log onto that network with the appropriate protocols. And so this is kind of where I think we begin to sort of broaden out from the open university definition of openness. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I chaired the first big OU course that was fully online. It wasn't about artificial intelligence, actually, it was about an introduction to using computers and the internet. And this is one of the graphics from then. This was back in 1999. So this was a good graphic back in 1999. We didn't have Canva then. But it's interesting, so part of this was opening up education to people who wanted to study this way. And I remember being told by a colleague at the OU who was kind of well schooled in how the OU wrote programs like, you'd be lucky to get 50 people on that course. No one wants to study that way. And we got 15,000 people. So it was very clear that people wanted to study this way. So when MOOCs came along in 2012, when everyone was saying universities have discovered large-scale internet courses, I was a bit bemused, I must admit. But this wasn't an open course, as in open that anyone is free to join. You can host join university to study them. But it opened up studying, I think, in a way of working that we didn't have before. And it was also mentioned that I was the first VLE director at the university. And we looked around, this was around 2003, 2004. And I think, like many institutions, what had happened was different departments, different schools had developed their own kind of way of approaching either, and you had this kind of range of technology, some of it in-house, some of it brought in, some of it modified. And we wanted to kind of unify that, partly for the student experience, and partly, I think, to kind of help academics have a kind of enterprise model that you could then roll out for training and upgrading and have roadmaps and those kind of things. And we looked at all the commercial providers, and in the end we decided on an open source VLE, Moodle, and partly that was because we wanted to modify it and be able to adapt it to our needs. We always felt each of the commercial ones wasn't quite what we needed to do. But I think also there was a strong sense of the ethos around open source, that we could make these modifications and contribute back to the community. So it had a kind of flexibility, but also kind of matched the Open University's ethics, I think, and approach. And I think it demonstrated to lots of other universities, you could take an open source VLE, and it wasn't a flaky piece of software. It was very reliable. We had over 100,000 students studying using our VLEs. You could operate at scale with this kind of content. Now, another flavour of openness that I think really came to dominate from 2001 onwards was OER, Open Educational Resources. And particularly if you're in North America, if you talk about open education, this is often what they think means, open educational resource approach. And this was kicked off by MIT, launched their open courseware model, where they gave away their content freely online under a Creative Commons license. And around 2006, the OU got involved in this, and we had funding from the Hewlett Foundation to develop OpenLearn. And that's been a really successful project. I was part of the team that started it, but I don't have much to do now, but they've really sort of gone from strength to strength with this. And I think, although the MIT thing was a very brave move at the time, the kind of general consensus of opinion at the time about online content was content is key, keep your content. And they were saying, we're going to give it away. And everyone was like, you can't do that. But actually, a lot of what MIT was giving away didn't make much sense outside of doing a degree at MIT. It was reading lists, some resources and stuff. Whereas open university content is designed to be studied independently. So we set up a model where a certain percentage of all new courses are sort of scheduled to go on to OpenLearn and be made available. Plus, we develop bespoke content. It's under a Creative Commons license. And it was interesting. So it gets about 2 million visitors a year to OpenLearn. It's the largest, particularly now things like Joram have closed down, the largest UK OER repository. And it was interesting during the pandemic, they saw something like a 400% increase in traffic kind of overnight. And that was for a mixture of people. There's lots of people who were studying at home and wanted to learn things. You know, they had time on their hands and wanted to kind of either think about reskilling their jobs or just for interest. But also a lot of educators, I think, kind of came there and said, I suddenly need to switch my learning online. How do I do that? And we had this kind of content they could take and use. We also had a course actually on how to teach online, which was fantastically popular during the pandemic. People suddenly needed to learn how to do that in lots of cases. So open educational resources, freely available, you know, to people to come. And actually for us, for the Open University, they've done a lot of work in sort of trying to justify this. I mean, there's a kind of public good justification. I think that comes back to one of the questions that someone asked by the previous speaker. And I think, you know, we could justify it on, you know, it's part of the OU's mission to help educate the public, but also that they've managed to really justify all this as a marketing spend that is it's a very good recruitment vehicle. And I think particularly for students now, we find that a good percentage of people who are studying OpenLearn are people who are interested in taking courses with us or with other people. When I was at university, you could afford to take a year at university, decide you didn't like studying that, and then go somewhere else. You weren't paying fees. Whereas now, if you're paying fees, you don't want to kind of waste that first year. So one of the ways to find out if you want to do psychology or anthropology is to take, you know, resources from a university about that subject. So it really helps people kind of test out stuff before they start studying. And I think it helps ease that transition into journey, which is about, you know, journeys into formal learning. Kind of it's often kind of seen as a very big step. So you're not studying and then you're studying a 3-year degree. And I think things like OER and later come to MOOCs really help kind of smooth some of that transition for people who aren't sure if studies for them. Another form of openness in education is what we might call digital scholarship or open scholarship. So I wrote a book called The Digital Scholar, and I think someone commented it probably should have been called The Open Scholar, and I think that's probably correct actually. It's really about ways of opening up our practice as academics and scholars. So I keep a blog. People now refer to them as long form blogging, as if it's like you're writing with a quill and pen. Yes, it already seems archaic. But blogging was like, I sort of started mine in 2006, and it felt a bit late to see then. And it's still going, and I think I often say to people, like, becoming a blogger was the best decision I made in my academic career. And I think it's a really interesting space. I find it a very useful space to go and explore ideas, be playful or creative, or, you know, give your view on things that you can't necessarily do through formal channels. And it's also had a very nice relationship, I think, with formal kind of output. So at least 3 books I've written have really come from my blog. It wasn't that I was blogging, writing a book. I've been blogging about a subject, so the Digital Scholar I mentioned, and then I wrote a book called The Battle for Open, and more recently 25 Years of Ed Tech. And I was just blogging those as things do, and I got to the end of doing them. I thought, actually, there's probably a book of these things, you know, and by just grabbing my blog posts and putting them into a Word document, you kind of had 30,000 words before you start, and actually you kind of need to change those words, but they're not appropriate. The kind of tone doesn't work, but at least it gets you going. And I think that kind of relationship to what you might call traditional outputs is very interesting as well, I think. And similarly, other people make good use of Twitter, podcasts, all those things. I think that kind of really helps blur the boundaries between the institution and the public, I think. MOOCs, so in 2013, the Open University launched FutureLearn, which some of you may know, some of you may have courses on there. But of course, this was part of following on from the big MOOC platforms in the US launching. And also I've got these badged open courses, which are on OpenLearn, and plus early on in the MOOC sphere. So I was friends with some of the early MOOC people like George Siemens and Stephen Downs, if you know them. And they used to do these things called connectedness MOOCs, which were kind of very open, really. You know, they didn't have a curriculum. It was sort of a phrase. The community is the curriculum, and they just like discuss it and work it around. And they were really about trying to think about what would it be like to teach with kind of the internet as your basic approach, and that kind of network approach. And I think MOOCs have a mixed history. I mean, I think there was a lot of hype about them at the start. You know, they were going to destroy higher education. Sebastian Thrun, who founded the first MOOCs, he's the guy who had the AI MOOC with 100,000 people, famously said that in 10 years' time, there'll only be 10 global providers, and I hope to be one of them, and that's obviously not been borne out. So I think there was all this kind of hype about them and stuff. But actually, once that has died away, we do see kind of consistent student numbers on them, and people find them useful for certain things and particular audiences, but they do come with issues. I'll come on to it in a minute, but it's mentioned that I'm the co-editor of Giant, and recently, so it's been 10 years since the year of the MOOC. 2012 was famously declared the year of the MOOC by the New York Times, and two of my colleagues, Casey Jordan and Freshly Bostofer, did a special issue around a decade since the year of the MOOC. I've done a really nice analysis actually of the kind of trends we've seen since then. So if you're interested in kind of how that's gone, it's worth kind of stuff there. Open research practice. So I think, again, just trying to apply openness to kind of the different aspects of what you might think of as a research cycle. So I run a project called GoGH, the Global OER Graduate Network, and we bring together doctoral students in OER every year for a conference, or for the past 2 years. And plus we support them during the year, and as well as trying to help them do research in openness, about open educational resources, open educational practice, we're trying to get them to adopt openness as part of their research practice, so to do open access publications, to share data, to be engaged in social media, and those kind of things. And that's been a really interesting process actually, and we've kind of developed in quite a strong community that turn up in lots of places. Open access publishing, so this has kind of been, I think open access publishing has probably been one of the big successes of the open movement. So there's lots of policies around open access, and even related, penetrated even to the ref, and things we have to put our publications up, whether it's green route or gold route, and there are lots of open access publishing journals. So I've co-edited the Giant journal, so we've always been open access, and the model we use there is we publish with an open access publisher called Ubiquity, and they run it for us, and they charge a nominal article processing charge, but actually we cover that, so we have a small budget internally, so it's free for people to publish. So that works quite well. I've also been lucky enough, and it doesn't work across all disciplines, to publish a number of books under an open access license as well. So with Ubiquity Press, with and more recently with Athabasca University Press. And that's a really interesting process, I think. So I published a book, 25 years of ed tech, and that came out in 2018, 2019. And it took 25 years of ed tech. So each year was a different technology. I sort of used to talk about why that technology was significant that year, what the kind of more general claims it had. And because it was open access, someone I know in Canada came along and said, I want to make an audio book out of it. So he put together a roster of people, different people to read each chapter, and then he released that on a weekly basis. And someone else, Laura Sweeney, said, why don't we do podcasts that kind of follow on from each audio book chapter as it's published? And so she put together another roster of people discussing the chapter. And actually, I think those podcasts are probably more interesting than the book itself, because people then, you bring together kind of different experts around each chapter. So, well, for me, this didn't work, and people talk about their own history with it, or kind of really expand on some of the issues that are brought up in the chapter. And all that kind of happens because it was openly licensed. It didn't need to get publishers' permissions to do that. So I think one of the interesting things about openness education here is it kind of has these kind of unpredictable consequences, which can really help open up a resource and have it reused elsewhere. Open textbooks. So it's interesting, in the US and Canada, there's been a real big movement around open textbooks. So these are textbooks which are openly licensed, and what they tend to do is pay people to write them off some of the kind of book scripts. They try to kind of get the big hitter undergraduate courses, Statistics 101, those things. And these books then are kind of freely available with the digital version, or you can buy the printed versions. And that's really been how OER has been realised in North America. And there's been this movement to create the Z degree, so zero cost degree in terms of textbook costs. And part of the issue there is that books cost so much in America, and they're very prescribed. You have to have this book, and it's going to cost you $200, and it's a really big outlay for lots of students. And we ran a project in the UK to see whether that open textbook approach would work here. And our findings were that textbook costs weren't quite such a big deal for lots of UK students, and textbooks tended to be part of a general reading list, not quite as prescribed as in North America. But what academics were interested in was the idea of being able to adapt and change open textbooks. And I think that's a very interesting model, and I'll come on to open pedagogy in a minute, but for instance, getting your students to modify a textbook is a matter of thing. What don't we like about this textbook? What's wrong with chapter 3? Particularly, I think when we talk about things about trying to have a greater range, greater diversity of voices included in lots of subjects, you get your students to think about what other voices, to find resources, and to bring them into this book. And I think that's very interesting in changing the dynamics and the nature of the relationship with knowledge. It's not just something you're receiving, rather something you're critiquing and taking part with and changing and modifying it as you see fit. And I think that has a kind of very broad benefit for kind of open education. And probably an area that I haven't done as much in as I probably like is the area of open pedagogy. The idea here is kind of really to apply aspects of openness to pedagogy. That can just be using OER in your teaching, but more sort of interestingly, I think it's about getting students to do things that kind of in the open. So I mentioned modifying open textbooks. Robin DeRosa did a lot of great work in the US in this, taking an American literature book and getting students to find resources to share those. And getting students to do things like blogging in the open, or modifying Wikipedia, or even create their own assignments, or talk about what structure the curriculum can take. So I think there's kind of really interesting aspects of openness that you can engage students with here. And lastly, I'm the chair of the Open degree at the Open University. And when we were first founded in 1969, I was 2 then, so I wasn't around, I can't take credit. The Open degree was the only degree we structured. This goes back to that kind of mission statement, I think, about being open to ideas. And the founding Vice Chancellor said, we think students are the best people to decide what they want their degrees to be. So students can choose from over 250 modules to combine into their own pathway and create these kind of multidisciplinary degrees. And they do combine them in so many different ways. It's not like there are 2 or 3 main pathways. They really combine them in lots of different ways. And part of the reason we can do that is because OU study is asynchronous and part-time often. So we're not constricted by the kind of logistics of timetable. I think that's an example of some of the teaching online benefits that people often don't see, particularly if you just have got the lecture model online and you're recreating some presentations. So I think an aspect of openness we don't talk about much is this idea of flexibility, creating the degree to suit your needs. And so a lot of our students say, I started studying a particular topic, I didn't like it, it's not what I thought it was going to be, but I switched to something else and combined it, or my life circumstances changed, my job changed, I wanted to do this, or I became interested in something else outside of work, I wanted to kind of combine that into my degree. So allowing students themselves to combine and create their own degrees is a kind of underexplored aspect of openness. So this was again going to be an interactive part. But I think just take a moment, I think, to kind of think of some of those aspects I've mentioned. I think for you in your role, what you do in your institution, what's most relevant for you, what's most important, whether that's MOOCs, digital, open scholarship, open educational resources, the idea of open research, open science, open access publishing, or open pedagogy. I'll let you just think about that for a moment. If people are joining online, they can put some on the chat. Okay, so I've mentioned kind of different aspects of openness that I've been involved in, and I think I was having a discussion with some colleagues once, and we said, again, people tend to use open education to mean lots of different things, and it seemed to me, it seemed to us, that those people don't talk to each other. There's kind of all these different groups in open education, none of them kind of reference each other or build with each other as well. But I didn't know if that was just kind of grumpy old man syndrome, or whether it was actually a thing. So we did some research, and a colleague of mine, Katie Jordan, did some really excellent work on citation analysis. So we came up with a big list of papers and various library searches using different terms around open education. And from those, Katie stripped all the references, and then she found the papers that they referenced as well. So what you build up is this kind of citation network. You can see which papers cite which others. So I hope this nice little GIF works. So you can see, so each dot here is a paper, and if there's a line between it, that means it's cited by another paper. And the more people cite it, you see the kind of bigger dots get. It's just showing, by the way. I hope it's showing. You're kind of getting a nice map building up. Cool. Okay. So what we came up with were these kind of clusters, which we then sort of mapped on to different publications, kind of different categories. And so we kind of came up with these 8 areas which we thought sort of broadly represented open access. And there's a kind of really interesting timeline to some of these things as well. So there's open education for open universities, open education in schools, MOOCs and OERs sort of tended to cluster around things. Use of social media, which I think you might call digital scholarship, open access publishing, often you'd find those in kind of library type or information science type journals. And then the two sorts of categories that maybe formed a bit of a glue between them were what you might call more generally open practices and e-learning. I think e-learning was a kind of real bridge between the early open education, distance education, going into OERs. But I think our general sense that these areas don't talk to each other much was borne out by this citation network. You see they're kind of very distinct clusters, and often there's not much overlap between them at all. So I think that kind of, when we talk about open education, it's important for us, actually people might be coming to it from very different routes. So if you're from the MOOC background, that might mean you never overlap with the OER background or social media people. So just to kind of give a kind of timeline of my experience through these things. So 1990s, we have the kind of traditional open education model, and then towards the late 90s into 2000s, e-learning becomes a factor around open education, I think. And then we have open source models being developed and adopted into higher education. And I think interesting when a lot of the early work around open education starting, online open education, a number of people tried to explicitly take the open source model of like a community of people developing and changing content. And so there's a lot of work, some of you may remember things like learning objects, the idea that we would design this content that could be shared around people. And that sort of then led into a lot of the OER field. And I wonder if there's a bit of an appetite for that model again now that so many institutions have had to implement some form of online learning. There really isn't any point that we all replicate a lot of the same content we could share and adapt it. In the mid-2000s, we had the kind of Web 2.0 exposure, and the whole idea of open scholarship and using blogs and social media, and open access models kind of really take root then. And then from 2009 to 2012, there's a kind of MOOC explosion, and then open research, open textbooks, and I think following as a field coming out, that is the whole idea of open pedagogy. So you can see a kind of development strand through these things. And what I tried to do then, with my very bad use of art in PowerPoint, is to try and think about how that maps onto some of the things you might think about for educating for the common good. So the orange blobs are kind of things you might think about that are things you want to do if you're educating for the common good. So public engagement, get public awareness, public understanding, widening participation, opening up education to more people to take part in it. Removal of barriers for people to participate in education, whether that's formal or informal. Making study flexible, so it doesn't rely on people coming to a campus necessarily. People have many different other requirements in their lives, so making study flexible for them. And then I think try and think about different forms of education. If we're excluding some people by our assumptions about what education should look like, and maybe we can change that. And I think you can then begin to see how each of these aspects of open education might overlap with some of these educating for the common good areas. Digital scholarship is a very good example, I think, in public engagement, and everyone being able to access papers and engage in open research projects. I think, again, it's a really good example. So if anyone's done any of these kind of public science projects where people get involved, and then we have removal of barriers. I think distance education, MOOCs, I think, and OER themselves really help people come into education. I mentioned kind of trying to smooth that curve, I think, and flexible study, around e-learning, allow people to work from home, and again, distance education as well. And widening participation, taking away some of those things that prevent people coming into education. So they to me kind of strike me as kind of things if you think about educating for the common good, which I guess, like open educational practice, we could all come up with what we mean by that phrase, but I think those might be elements you'd want to include in that. And you can see there's a kind of very strong overlap, I think, with lots of aspects of open education. So this is the kind of evangelist part, but that way there's a critical part coming too. So the answer to your question is, whatever your question is open. So I think, in terms of educating for the common good, you might think about sharing is a kind of a default practice in lots of open practice. If you're blogging, if you're producing open educational resources, the key thing that overlaps lots of them is sharing content, sharing ideas, sharing stuff, and that's kind of always a good thing. Probably it depends what the ideas are. Adaptation is good, so taking someone else's content, building on it, making it suit your needs, suit your audiences. I think, again, that kind of, you can see how that works very well for educating for the common good, I think, because not all audiences are the same, so it becomes less of a kind of bespoke, less of a kind of dictating model, more of a kind of working with people, kind of community-driven model. And I think a lot of this stuff can be quite democratic. I think it allows a route in for lots of new voices. I'll certainly see in conferences I go to now, lots of keynotes are people who probably wouldn't have been keynotes in a kind of more traditional era. They're kind of people with interesting voices on Twitter, but not necessarily professors with the big kind of publications. There's a certain transparency around a lot of openness. You can follow what people have done and sort of follow their research and have open data, this kind of thing. There's an anti-monopoly view to lots of it, and a very strong kind of social justice. I think one of the real movements we've seen in the open educational resource field is a kind of OER for social justice approach, you see. You can argue that's kind of a better fit, I think, for lots of things around educating for the public good. But it's not all good. So I think there's lots of stuff around here that's, as always, I think it's very important to be kind of aware of a lot of the critiques around open education and open educational practice. So, for example, lots of the open source communities are full of tech bros and kind of very often misogynistic and recognise certain types of work and reinforce certain codes and things, and they can be very problematic. And we see lots of people come out of those communities. It's the idea that it's all kind of a lovely community where everyone supports each other. It's certainly not true. MOOCs have been shown to be the people who tend to take MOOCs and particularly pass MOOCs are people who already have degrees. This idea that it's kind of going to be a massive, democratising force, and everyone will take them, actually ends up reinforcing existing privilege often in places. So if we start saying it's really good to have MOOCs on your CV, then the people who tend to have them are the people who are already privileged. And this idea of open washing, so it builds on the idea of greenwashing, where advertisers say things are natural or green because that kind of has good connotations. We've seen a certain element of open washing, so people claiming things to be open because it kind of sounds good, and it's lots of commercial providers. So I could mention some publishers, but I won't, kind of trying to use it as a way to kind of get into the market. And I think it's very true to say that openness is not always good for students. I talked about some open pedagogy approaches, kind of encourage people to blog in the open, but it depends what you're blogging about and who you are. I'm a white, middle-aged man in Europe who blogs about a non-controversial subject. My experience doing this stuff would be very different, to be a black woman in America, talking about issues of racism. So the idea that it's always good to be open and to expose your students to that, I think, is not always true. And often, learning is a very vulnerable process, I think, and I think often providing students with a safe state in which to do that is very beneficial. And I also think there's an element of openness. It's like people think, oh, well, because it's open, it should be free. And I think often that can hide labour costs. People say, how can you have your conference about openness and charge people to attend it? Well, it still involves labour, it still involves work, and that work should be rewarded. And I think a lot of the work that's done online, so there's some really good social media chats and groups that people run, and often they perform quite a lot of the staff development kind of heavy lifting. They're done for free, and often that kind of labour is done by women, I think more disproportionately than men. So I think there's a dangerous kind of openness hides these labour costs that we expect to be there. So I think it's worth bearing in mind those kind of downsides to openness. I'll just wrap up now. So I thought, for discussion, if we have time, but feel free to come back and anything else I've said. We might want to think about what aspects of openness would meet the needs of your learners. Kind of, really think of it as kind of a toolbox you're choosing from. What I can take those bits, that'd be really useful, but I don't want to do those bits. So what aspects don't meet the needs of your learners, or particular audiences you want to get to, whether that's outside of the institution or within the institution. What are the costs of openness? These things are not free, and you should recognise those costs. But also, what are the opportunities for you? What could you do differently that would maybe help you support different types of students or different audiences? And lastly, in the frame of the conference, is it a driver for the common good? I think that's me. I'm ending with a picture of a cute puppy so that people can sympathetic for us.
Okay, so do you want to take thoughts on your questions, or should we go with questions from your
Whichever way. They were just prompts in case we had that kind of deathly silence bit at the end. People,
so the audience comes up.
If people have questions, go ahead.
Okay, so any questions starting from the audience? Oh, I saw Sonia had a question.
Yes.
Sonia, yeah.
So there is a question from Sonia, and I'm just reading it to you. In my 18 years of being an educational technology professional, I've seen university, public sector institutions that they are becoming steadily more closed rather than open. It used to be that a member of the public could walk into a lecture and just listen to it if they felt like it. This is no longer the case, of course, as everything needs an access card. And so my question is, what you think was the main driver for that? Terrorism, IP protection, competition with other higher education institutions? And should we go back to that open door public access ethos? And if that ship has sailed, should we force unis to give this kind of access online at least?
Excellent question. Hi, Sonia. That is a good question. And I think there's a very long history of open education. So there used to be talks in cafes in Germany and stuff, in the 18th century, and the kind of public lecture and stuff. So it's not something that's just something come about recently. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think you're absolutely right to call it. I think it's probably a mixture of things. And I think sometimes we see a kind of real tension in society. It's like, so I think it probably arises from lots of kind of policies and health and safety, the dreaded health and safety. But those kind of things, I think, well, actually, things need to be much more controlled. I think the experience of lots of academics who've been around for a reasonable time is that you've got much less freedom, I think, in what you do as an academic. And I think in some ways that's been the appeal for things like open scholarship and digital scholarship, is that it's kind of a space outside of your formal structures that allows you to do that kind of experimentation freedom that perhaps was more uniform as part of your job before. So I think it's a bit like when people complain about the amount of money that universities spend on administration. And they say, oh, it's gone up by this amount, as if it's kind of just something universities have decided to do. But actually, that amount of money we spend on administration is a result of policies that are in society. You think about the administration we need to have now about health and safety, reporting for research, finance, diversity, equity, inclusion, those things like 20 years ago, we didn't have any of that administration. But then the same people who say, should we spend all this money on administration, then also say, would be the first people to complain if their child was at university wasn't treated properly. Like, where's your policy for this? So I think there's a kind of tension there between what we want from society and what we want from universities. So we might not want people to be able to walk into lectures all the time. They might feel that isn't appropriate. But certainly I think openness, and even at the Open University, it's fair to say openness isn't always at the heart, isn't always the first thing we're trying to do. And I think that could be a real question we ask of all things. What can we open up about this? How can we make this more open? Even if that's like making some content available from your courses, and whether that's some recorded lectures or some content, And I think it's a good question to ask. If we things like knowledge exchange are kind of very popular, but part of that comes from just lowering barriers to the university and reducing some of that kind of the walls around the university. So we've kind of had two things happen simultaneously. We've kind of blurred the boundaries to the university, and kind of all online, and you can get to know your academics in Facebook or whatever. But at the same time, we've also kind of reinforced, I think, a lot of structure through policies that exist in society generally. So it's a long-winded way to not give a proper answer, but there you go.
I think if you would just first.
I'm Valia Mazioglu, and I would like to say something in relation to the previous comment. I was this summer at UK British Conference of Political Psychology online, and then there were some people who got in with fake names, and they were posting some obscenities. So the person who was supposed to be in control tried to evacuate them, and then they came back with different names like Tom Brady or something else. So there was a question, we were supposed to be talking about some aspect of common good. It was something on democracy. So is this a good idea to evacuate people? What kind of support of what is obscene and what,
Yeah, I've been in a conference where that's happened as well. People come in and just bomb down inside and trash it. And I think you just have to, I don't think we should beat ourselves up about kicking those people out, but they're there to be trolls. They're not engaging in a conversation. They just want to cause upset and harm. And I think, and you see this a lot on Twitter, and I think 10, 20 years ago, I think there was a kind of strong view about the freedom of ideas, the marketplace of ideas, and stuff. And, we should be allowed to say what we want on Twitter and stuff, and bad ideas will be cast out, kind of thing. But I think the way that the network and social media has been kind of weaponized, kind of use the phrase, I think is it's naive of us to kind of think you can just do that now. So I think you do need to kind of be careful. You do need to have in place proper policies that protect people. You have a duty of care to people at a conference or within a building or whatever. So it's the same thing. I think people are coming in and being deliberately offensive and trying to cause upset. And it's our their job to try and protect them and to create a safe space and a safe environment. So I'm not too worried about people putting policies in place to kind of protect people from that kind of thing. Although you can do things like, recent conference I chaired, OER 22, we had, so we streamed the videos of the talks, so they're going out live on YouTube, so anyone can access them, but they're not part then of the Zoom group or something. So there are different ways you can approach things. I'm not sure, did that answer your question?
Thank you. I think we just have time for a question from Dilly.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, Martin. It's Dilly Fung, Pro-Director Education here at LSE. Nice to see you again. Thanks very much for your talk. I was interested in, well, lots of things that you said, but I particularly picked up on the point about potential tension between open access in terms of, producing open access materials and the respect for people's labour. And so, as an example, when my 2017 book on connected curriculum is fully open access through UCL Press. It's had well over 40,000 downloads. I don't know how many people would have accessed the book on higher education curriculum if it had just only been in paper form. I'm sure it would have been closer to 40 than 40,000. And I've had, lovely interactions with scholars and interested parties around the world because of that open access. So in many ways, it's been great. And sometimes when I've been promoting this idea of open access, people have quite understandably said to me, yeah, but you spent hundreds of hours working, writing that, and you haven't had any reward, any monetary reward for it. And of course, I was able to do that at a time in my life where it wasn't necessary for me to be rewarded in monetary terms for that labour. But there will be many people working across higher education who absolutely and rightly need to be have that reward. So I just wondered, perhaps make to make it a sort of focus question. How do you square that circle yourself? Do you balance out things that you make freely available of your own work and then sort of make money from other things, or how do you play that?
Yeah, I think it's different. If I was not employed at university and writing was the way I earned my living, then absolutely I wouldn't necessarily be making my books open access or through. I think I realised a long time ago that writing academic books wasn't going to get me a yacht anywhere anytime soon. So, so even actually the difference between the ones that weren't open access and the ones that are in terms of annual income is I get about £200. I check every now and then, like 200 quid. That's about it. But it's never going to be much. And I think as an academic, I'm employed to write that material, and I don't necessarily need financial reward from that. And so I think, like with you, it's actually much more useful to have more people read it. And I think that's always been really interesting to me. I think because I wrote 2 or 3 books that were open access, and I've written some that are open access. And I think I feel much easier saying to people, "Oh, I've written a book on that. Here it is." And I'm not saying to them, "Go and buy it." I can just give them the link if I do it. And again, someone has taken one of my books and sort of made it a course around it and stuff. And I think you just get to do more interesting things with it. And that's kind of my job as an academic, is to kind of share knowledge, and that's kind of what I'm being paid for. So I don't really want to have income from that, in the same way that when we write academic journal articles, we don't get paid for them unless you're very lucky. So that's not an issue. But I think it depends. If you're writing a kind of textbook for like the kind of statistics 101 people, you kind of want that to be a seller, that's where you earn income, then you might want to kind of get paid for it. And I think one of the models that's been really interesting in the US is to pay people up front to do the production. So it's a flip of the cost. So people don't pay to purchase, but you pay for production. And in British Columbia, there's this BC Campus project, and there the regional government said we will fund the production of these books. So an author then can earn quite a decent chunk of money to write the book. They don't get any sales. And I think that's a kind of a good model. It's just that we've kind of got used in some ways to the money going in. There's a lot of money in education in terms of buying stuff. We get used to purchasing material rather than paying to produce it and then having it free for everyone. And you can see, and lots of libraries that UCL one of them are beginning to sort of make some of that flip, I think, in terms of their expenditure. So I think that's a good model to kind of recognise that you are doing this for nothing, or if it's not part of your paid work, you can compensate for it still. But congratulations on 40,000 downloads. That is good. Well done.
Thank you, Martin. I think we're out of time for questions, so I'd like to just thank Martin again for his